On January 11, 2024, the Texas National Guard took control of Shelby Park, located along the Rio Grande River on the border of the United States and Mexico. The Guard set up barbed wire fences and pushed back federal border patrol agents who, in their opinion, could not do their job. Then the Guards began to block and detain illegal migrants. In parallel, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed an emergency statement on the closure of the park due to the large-scale migration crisis. In response, President Biden and his administration demanded to remove barriers and return the border sector to federal agents. The case even reached the Supreme Court, which, under pressure from Washington bureaucrats, recognized the actions of the Texas National Guard as illegal. Nevertheless, these political games did not scare the Texans. On January 24th, Governor Abbott denied the feds access to the border and promised to protect the sovereignty of the state. He was supported by 25 Republican governors. Florida, Oklahoma, and 10 other states sent their National Guard troops to help Texas in the fight against Washington. The actions of Texans to protect their state from migrants were approved by presidential candidate Donald Trump, who promised after his victory to solve this problem once and for all. The United States is one step closer to a new civil war, but will the crisis on the border trigger the subsequent bloody events? The migration crisis worsened in the United States during the Obama presidency. Under Trump, it was somehow restrained. Now, during the Biden presidency, a real migrant flood has begun, which has overwhelmed all the southern states. First of all, this was caused by the so-called open door policy, which was carried out in defiance of the Republicans. So, shortly after the inauguration, Biden lifted the state of emergency imposed by Trump on the southern border of the United States and stopped the construction of the wall. He also lifted Trump's 2017 ban on the entry of people from 14 countries, most of which are Muslim. In 2021, Biden banned immigration authorities from expelling people who came to the United States as children with undocumented immigrant parents, and called on Congress to protect the 700,000 undocumented immigrants covered by this policy. He also repealed a 2019 decree limiting federal funding for refugee migrants could now receive benefits from the federal government. At the same time, in 2021, Biden intended to raise the limit on the annual admission of refugees from 15,000 to 125,000, which he gradually managed to do by 2024. Biden's next executive order prohibited immigration and customs enforcement agents from seeking deportation on the grounds of drug crimes, simple assault, money laundering, crimes against property, fraud, tax crimes, extortion, or charges without a criminal record. That is, now immigration and customs enforcement could be deported for violent assault, i.e. murder, rape, and well-documented gang ties. The main reform was supposed to be the law on U.S. citizenship, which was supposed to radically change the system of immigration, visa, and border control. In particular, it would give citizenship to 11 million illegal migrants and their children who are already living in the United States. In general, this law would legalize tens of millions of illegal migrants to the United States and make them citizens. It is believed that this altruistic act pursued a very specific political goal. After legalization, migrants would have the right to vote, and they would have voted for the Democratic Party and Biden. A similar scheme has already shown its effectiveness in Spain and other European countries. However, this law did not receive support in the House of Representatives and the Senate, which is why they tried to pull it apart into separate bills, which have so far drowned in a bureaucratic swamp. The result of this policy was a massive wave of illegal migration. In total, since the beginning of Biden's presidency, about 4 million people have crossed the southern border and half crossed it illegally. The open door policy has hit Texas the hardest, which has the longest border with Mexico. Immediately after the start of the Democratic migration revolution, the number of detentions and illegal infiltrations on the Texas-Mexico border increased by 278%, as in all border states. However, unlike their neighbors, the Texans decided to take the situation under strict control. In 2021, Texas Governor Greg Abbott called the influx of migrants an invasion and announced the launch of Operation Lone Star. By order of the governor, Texas law enforcement agencies, state police, National Guard, and Texas Rangers units were granted the right to independently guard the state border with Mexico, which included the construction of barbed wire, as well as the capture of illegal migrants from Latin America and other countries of the world. After the operation began in 2021, Texas became the only state where local police could arrest migrants for illegal entry, as well as detain them and send them to prison. In the fall of that year, the Texas government allocated $2 billion to secure the Texas border. Moreover, $750 million went to the completion of the Trump Wall. In 2022, Texas began the transit of illegal immigrants to Democratic states, and above all to the capital, Washington, D.C. About 900 buses were allocated for this operation. According to various estimates, as of January 2024, about 100,000 migrants agreed to go by bus and plane to the cities of refuge. Let me remind you that the sanctuary cities were organized by Democrats and named so because local authorities do not extradite illegal migrants to federal authorities, thereby preventing them from being deported. So, since April 2022, more than 12.5 thousand migrants have been transported to Washington, 37.5 thousand to New York, more than 30,000 to Chicago, about 4,000 to Philadelphia, 16,000 were taken to Denver, and more than 2,000 were sent to Los Angeles. The mass transportation of migrants to these cities has led to housing crises in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., as well as budget deficits due to an increase in the number of benefits paid to migrants. Local officials in sanctuary cities criticized Texas' program to transport migrants and responded by seeking federal assistance, fining charter bus companies transporting migrants and sending them to other cities. In 2022, Greg Abbott declared Mexican cartels terrorist organizations and deployed additional National Guard units at the border, which were reinforced with M113 armored personnel carriers. In 2023, Texas deployed additional tactical border forces and began installing floating barriers in the Rio Grande in an attempt to prevent illegal border crossings. And in December 2023, Abbott signs a law declaring illegal immigration a state crime and allowing Texas law enforcement agencies to arrest undocumented migrants anywhere in the state. It also allows state courts to issue orders to expel arrested migrants back across the Mexican border. As a result, during the 3 years of Operation Lone Star, Texas law enforcement forces detained almost 500,000 illegal migrants. 34,600 were arrested for criminal offenses. At the same time, Border Guard seized 454 million doses of fentanyl. A year after the start of the operation in Texas, the increase in migrants was only 9%, while in neighboring Arizona, California, and New Mexico, this figure rose to 62%. In 2024, against the background of the upcoming U.S. presidential elections, the crisis on the border escalated. On January 11, 2024, the Texas National Guard took control of a section of the border in the city, along the Rio Grande River. This happened immediately after the order of the governor of the state to close the checkpoint in the area. The Texas National Guard also banned U.S. Border Patrol agents from working in the area. Around the same time, the state authorities began to erect barbed wire, fences, and gates. In response, the U.S. Federals issued an ultimatum to Texas. The National Guard had to end the blockade and allow federal agents to resume operations in the area. If Texas does not agree to comply by the end of the day, the department said it would refer the matter to the Department of Justice for appropriate action. But the Office of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton redoubled its efforts, saying that Texas will not give up. On January 22, the Supreme Court of the United States issued an order to lift an injunction that prohibited Border Patrol agents from cutting the wire installed by the National Guard. 2 days later, Abbott announced that Texas would still deny federal authorities access to the border, promising to protect the sovereignty of the state. Abbott was supported by 25 Republican states. They blamed President Joe Biden and issued a joint statement saying, instead of upholding the rule of law and ensuring border security, the Biden administration attacked Texas for taking measures to protect American citizens from the catastrophic levels of illegal immigration, hard drugs, and terrorists entering the United States. Florida, Oklahoma, and 10 other states sent their National Guard troops to help Texas in the fight against Washington. The actions of Texans to protect their state from migrants were approved by presidential candidate Donald Trump, who promised after his victory to solve this problem once and for all. Truckers from the southern states also joined in support of Texans under the slogan, "Take Back Our Border." They organized a convoy of 700 heavy trucks, which moved straight to the southern border. Meanwhile, in Texas, the National Guard has increased its readiness level and has moved additional units and armored vehicles to the border. Because Biden could use his powers to suddenly intervene militarily, citizens of Texas also mobilized to fight Washington and made militia battalions, which also moved to the border. However, on January 27, Joe Biden caved in and made concessions. He said he would close the border to migrants in the south of the country as soon as Congress approves a bill that would give him the appropriate authority. He also stated that he was ready to review migration policy, but with special powers. Now the parties are in a state of expectation. Abbott, along with a coalition of Republican states, is waiting for Washington's move, while Biden is waiting for Texas' reaction. Nevertheless, so far, Texas is leading, while Washington is wiping away the bloody snot. The battle over the Mexican border has led to an intensification of the political crisis that has been going on in the United States for the 4th year. The governor of Texas has been organizing a holiday of disobedience for 3 years. He does not just criticize the policy of the federal government, but actively and successfully fights with it, which de facto discredits Washington. By doing so, he sets a bad example to other states and splits the Union into pieces. The collapse of the USSR began according to the same scenario. First there was a front of friendly socialist countries of Eastern Europe, and then a démarche of the elites of the Baltic states, Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, backed by force on the ground. It's one thing to lead a bureaucratic war by suing each other, and it's completely another to seize the border and to rattle weapons. The reaction of the federal government is also surprising. For 3 years, the White House has been turning a blind eye to the Republicans' arbitrariness and suffering Texas slaps. Many says that Washington is demonstrating its weakness, but perhaps this weakness is intentional, to provoke the Republicans even more, and at the right moment to hit them on the hands, or even better on the head, so that the consequences of the so-called January 6th rebellion seem like flowers. Think about it. 3 years ago people were allowed on an unauthorized excursion to the parliament, where entrance is always free in all countries of the world. And then they were accused of terrorism and rebellion. It's scary to imagine what the Washington's bureaucrats and Democrats will do to those who dare to take up arms against them and their sacred migrant cow. After that, talking about the Civil War does not seem so illusory, and large-scale repression literally looms on the horizon. On the other hand, Biden let it slip. He literally said, "Give me emergency powers and I will deal with everything." Of course, this was said in the context of solving the crisis on the border, but he can really deal with everything, especially during the U.S. presidential election. Democratic press has already begun to write that in the current situation, Biden needs to be made a dictator for a day so that he can solve all the crises that the United States is facing. You may say, but how is that? This cannot happen in the stronghold of democracy and freedom, and everything that is happening now is a circus typical for a banana republic, but not for a world hegemon. You will find out the answer to this question in our next video. There you will also find out if the elderly Akela missed or came up with a cunning plan.